Margaret Fulton never planned on becoming the talk of the prairie. She was just a widow struggling to keep her small homestead alive on the dusty plains of Dakota Territory. But a single act of kindness changed everything the night she found an injured Lakota warrior shivering in her barn, terrified and alone. By dawn, her world had exploded into tension, tradition, and unexpected alliances. As the sunrise painted the sky with brilliant streaks of gold, the entire Lakota tribe surrounded her humble farm. Some brought arrows, others rifles, each with a singular question. Why did this woman dare to shelter one of their own? The year was 1874, and Margaret Fulton had grown used to the isolation of the frontier. After losing her husband, Douglas, to a rattlesnake bite 2 summers past, she found solace in the daily chores of running their modest farm. The crops were meager, but consistent rows of corn, a few scrawny chickens, and a milk cow with a cranky disposition. Dust storms ravaged the Great Plains from time to time, punishing her and anyone else stubborn enough to try taming these lands. Yet Margaret chose to remain. She believed that the memory of her husband lived in every fence post he had put down. Her days began before sunrise. She'd rise from her narrow bed in the creaking farmhouse, slip on a worn cotton dress, and light a lantern. On one such morning, as she was fixing a pot of coffee, she heard an odd thump coming from the barn. At first, she ignored it, blaming her fatigue, but the sound didn't subside. Something was stumbling about in the darkness, disturbing the horses whose nervous whinnies drifted to the farmhouse. She grabbed her husband's old shotgun from behind the door. The weight of the weapon in her hands felt both reassuring and uncomfortable. She had never been one for violence. As she neared the barn, the air thickened with tension. The rustle of hay and the low moan of someone injured reached her ears. With each step, her boots kicked up swirling dust. She could smell the manure, the sweat of the horses, and a faint trace of blood. Cautiously, she slid open the barn door. Her lantern's weak glow revealed an unsettling sight. A man collapsed on the straw, pressing a trembling hand to his side. In the dim light, Margaret could see a deep gash in his abdomen crusted with dried blood. He wore buckskin leggings and a leather vest with beadwork so finely detailed it could only be Lakota craftsmanship. His raven black hair was braided, and around his neck hung a small medicine pouch. He looked young, but the lines of pain on his face spoke of a life that had already seen far more hardship than Margaret could fathom. Startled, he tried to rise, eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Wait," Margaret said, her voice shaking. She lowered her shotgun, not wanting to escalate things. She noticed he was unarmed, or so it seemed. His tomahawk lay broken in a corner. "You're hurt." He didn't understand her words, it seemed, but he caught the tone. He moaned softly, pressing his hand tighter against his wound. For a second, Margaret wondered if she should run to fetch the local sheriff. But the sheriff had made it clear he had little patience for Indian problems, as he so harshly put it. And out here, by the time she ran to town and back, the man could die. Steeling herself, Margaret set the shotgun aside. She gently placed a hand on the injured man's shoulder. He winced, but he didn't fight her. Slowly, carefully, she helped him to stand. He wobbled, nearly collapsed, and she ended up half carrying him toward a makeshift cot used for birthing calves. She hurried to fetch bandages and water from the farmhouse. So began a sleepless night of cleaning the wound and doing her best to stitch the gash. She offered him some laudanum for the pain, though she had no idea if he'd trust the small brown bottle that smelled so pungent. He peered at her, with dark, intense eyes, as though trying to read her intentions. Margaret moved slowly, speaking soft words of comfort. He likely did not comprehend. but maybe he felt their meaning. Gradually the tension eased. When the new dawn stretched thin gold lines across the eastern sky, she finally slid down to the ground, exhausted. The man lay breathing shallowly, but he was alive. Margaret had no illusions that he might be a wanted fugitive or part of a raiding party. She didn't know if his wound was from a clash with the US cavalry or some other conflict. Yet something in his eyes, an unspoken plea, kept her from turning him away. She dozed off, certain that once the sun was fully up, she'd find the strength to decide her next steps. Little did she know that the next day would bring not only one injured Lakota warrior into her life, but an entire tribe to the threshold of her farm, shaking the fragile peace of the frontier to its core. The sun was high when Margaret woke to the sound of horses. Many horses pounding the earth. Alarm twisted her stomach into knots. She scrambled to her feet, muscles protesting after a night spent on the barn floor. The Lakota warrior was still lying on the cot. She glanced at him momentarily, torn between tending to him and investigating the commotion. He was stable for now. Her presence was more urgently needed outside. Cracking open the barn door, she was greeted by a sight that stole the breath from her lungs. Arrayed across the horizon, dozens of Lakota riders formed a wide semicircle, their horses stirring dust into golden clouds. Men, women, and even children on ponies, all of them looking directly at her property. The tension was palpable. Some of the warriors carried rifles, others held bows with arrows nocked. A few brandished traditional lances that shimmered with sunlight. Every one of them wore expressions of solemn resolve. Margaret's chest tightened. Her heart hammered in her ears. She recognized these were Lakota, perhaps Oglala, or Hunkpapa. She wasn't certain, but she did know the history. Conflict with settlers was frequent and often brutal. Though a peace treaty, specifically the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, had promised the Lakota sovereign territory, tensions flared whenever white homesteaders and natives crossed paths. She recalled stories from neighbors about families disappearing in the night or farms burned to the ground. The prejudice and rumors ran rampant in the nearby town of Grayton. Yet she saw no immediate aggression from the tribe encircling her land. They were simply there, surrounding her, waiting. Slowly, she stepped out onto the porch, unarmed, her hands visible. If they saw she wasn't a threat, maybe they'd hold their fire. 2 riders detached from the group and approached the farmhouse. One was an older man, with hair so long it fell against his horse's flanks. He wore a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers. The ends dyed red. The other was a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, with piercing eyes and a determined set to her jaw. Margaret's knees trembled, but she forced herself to remain steady. She held up her hands, palms open. "I mean no harm," she said, though she knew they might not understand her English. The old man spoke in Lakota, his voice resonant, echoing across the silent yard. Margaret shook her head, searching for any sign of comprehension. He repeated himself more slowly. She managed only a helpless shrug, indicating she didn't speak his language. Then the young woman spoke her Lakota, a softer lilt, though equally unintelligible to Margaret. Sensing her confusion, the woman reached into a leather pouch on her belt and pulled out a small crucifix. She said something pointing at it, then pointed at Margaret, possibly asking if she believed in the Christian God, or if she recognized it. Margaret nodded, uncertain if that was the correct response. The woman sighed in frustration. At last, the old man slid off his horse with surprising agility for his age. He touched his chest and said something that sounded like Sung Manitu. Then he gestured to the wide arc of riders behind him. He spoke again, his words more urgent. Margaret caught the tone. "Where is he? Where is our kinsman?" Margaret realized with a surge of alarm they had come looking for the wounded warrior she had taken in. Instinct warred with reason. Should she lead them to him? What if they didn't believe she had tried to help him? If he died under her care, would they exact revenge? But reason won out. She had nothing to gain by hiding the truth. She beckoned them to follow, stepping carefully toward the barn. The old man and the young woman came behind her, leaving the rest of the tribe on edge, watchful. In the barn, the injured warrior stirred at the commotion. His eyes flicked to Margaret, then to the visitors. Relief or apprehension flickered in his expression. Margaret couldn't tell. The young woman rushed forward, kneeling beside the cot. She placed a hand on the wounded man's forehead, speaking in a strained voice. The older man approached more slowly, also speaking softly. Margaret found her own breathing ragged with anxiety, yet no one looked at her with overt hostility. It was as though they recognized that she had tried to tend him. Outside, more voices rose. Some Lakota dismounted and peered curiously at the farm buildings. A handful of riders advanced near the porch. Though they didn't draw their weapons, Margaret felt their intensity. Her hand itched to grab the shotgun for protection, but she knew that would be the worst possible move right now. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to remain calm. Eventually, the young woman turned to Margaret. Their eyes locked. She raised her hand to her own chest, then gestured to Margaret. In halting, accented English, she said, "Thank you." That moment of human connection, a single phrase bridging the gulf of culture, language, and suspicion, made Margaret's eyes well with tears she refused to shed. She dipped her head in acknowledgement, relief flooding her. Maybe they wouldn't burn her homestead to the ground after all. Maybe they recognized her compassion. But the tribe had come for a reason beyond a simple rescue. The worry in the older man's eyes told Margaret that more was at stake. Had he come to retrieve a revered warrior? A relative, a scouting party, had likely been searching for the missing man all night. And now they had found him here on a white woman's farm. All the old man's quiet intensity seemed to say, "This is bigger than you can imagine." Within an hour, the Lakota set up a temporary encampment on the open prairie just beyond her fields. Typus rose swiftly. Children chased each other in the tall grass, and war-painted horses grazed. From a distance, it looked as though an entire village had sprung up overnight. Margaret stood on her porch arms, crossed over her apron as riders came and went. Some approached her small well for water. She permitted it without complaint. She couldn't see a way to refuse. Besides, she didn't want to. She had once believed in kindness above all else, a belief her husband had shared. But fear gnawed at her as the sheer size of this gathering grew. As dusk approached, the situation remained uneasy but not outright hostile. They had not demanded she leave, nor harmed her property. She noted one older woman guiding her granddaughter, pointing at Margaret's farm buildings, explaining something in a language Margaret couldn't decipher. Another group of young men scouted the edges of her fields, presumably ensuring no cavalry or armed settlers were lurking nearby. By the time the second night fell, Margaret felt both exhaustion and worry. She lit the oil lamp in her kitchen. Through the window, she could see the flicker of their campfires, stretching into the distance. The wounded man remained in the barn with the young Lakota woman, his sister, she presumed, watching over him. Occasionally, the older man, Sung Manitou, visited. Each time he left, he'd pass Margaret with a polite nod. There was no anger there, just a grave contemplation. Margaret let out a shaky breath. Every nerve in her body tingled with tension. She had no illusions about the precariousness of her situation. Had it been any other neighbor who found the warrior, the tribe might have encountered a bullet rather than a helping hand. But if the local authorities discovered a large group of Lakota camping on her farm, how long before the cavalry arrived? The memory of other violent incidents haunted her mind. She feared the precarious peace could shatter at any moment. Still, she couldn't regret helping the wounded man. Something in his eyes reminded her of Douglas, the day he had nearly severed his leg in a farming accident. The helplessness, the shock, the desperation. If someone had refused to help her husband, then how different her life would have been. Compassion was all that she had to offer, and perhaps it would be enough. Word of the Lakota encampment spread quickly to Grayton, the nearest settlement. By midday of the second day, a small group of townspeople rode out to see the spectacle for themselves. Among them was Sheriff John McKenna, a solidly built man with a drooping moustache who prided himself on maintaining law and order, though that often meant preserving his own biases. Accompanying him were 4 deputies and a few curious onlookers, including Jacob Brindle, the local store owner, who had never hidden his disdain for the Redskins, as he derisively called them. They halted at the edge of Margaret's property, scanning the sea of teepees and the busy Lakota camp. Nervousness crackled in the air. Margaret stood on her porch, arms crossed as the sheriff urged his horse forward. He tipped his hat in a perfunctory greeting. "Well, Maggie," he said. "Care to explain what's going on here?" Margaret bristled. She disliked being called Maggie by a man who showed her so little respect. "They're not here to cause trouble," she said, voice firm. "I found an injured warrior in my barn. He was badly hurt. His kin came to tend to him." Sheriff McKenna narrowed his eyes. "You're telling me they just set up camp on your farm? No harm done, no demands?" She shook her head. "They've asked nothing of me except to let them care for their wounded and draw water from the well. So far, there's been no threat." Jacob Brindle spat onto the ground. "I don't like it. 100 or more Indians out here could be planning a raid. You're a fool to let 'em stay, Margaret." A flash of anger flared in her. "They're human beings," she snapped, "and they have someone wounded. Do you think the Great Plains are only for white folks to roam?" Brindle's face turned red, and he opened his mouth to retort, but the sheriff raised a placating hand. "Hold on. We can't have a war party living on the outskirts of town," McKenna said. "People are scared. They've come here to find you worried for your safety." Margaret clenched her jaw. "I appreciate the concern, but I don't believe they intend violence. Not after I helped one of their own." McKenna studied her silently for a long moment, then turned to the encampment. A handful of Lakota were watching the gathering of white riders with equal suspicion. The older leader, Sung Manitu, stood tall, gazing impassively, as if waiting for some signal. "We'll see about that," the sheriff muttered under his breath. He rode closer, flanked by his deputies. Sung Manitu stepped forward. For a tense moment, neither spoke. Then McKenna tried speaking in English. When that failed, he gestured widely with his arms, signifying that this land belonged to the town and they should move on. Sung Manitu remained impassive. Finally, one of the younger Lakota who knew a bit of English approached. He haltingly explained that they intended no harm and would leave once their injured man could ride. McKenna pressed them, demanding to know if they were alone or if more warriors were coming. The Lakota man shrugged, uncertain how to answer in limited English. The standoff lasted for several minutes, the tension thick as a coiled rattlesnake. Margaret's stomach churned with anxiety, recalling how just one spark of misunderstanding could ignite fatal violence. She stepped forward. "Sheriff," she said clearly, "they have promised to go once he's well enough. Let's not force a fight where we don't need one." Jacob Brindle glowered. "We can't just take their word for it." McKenna chewed his lip, frustration contorting his features. "If they stay, it'll spook the rest of the county. And if the U.S. Army hears there's a large encampment of Sioux on homestead land, they might come rolling in with Gatling guns. That's a bloodbath waiting to happen." Margaret couldn't deny that possibility. She recalled the stories of the Minnesota uprisings a decade prior, and the more recent tensions after the discovery of gold in the Black Hills. The cavalry rarely cared about nuance when dealing with tribes labeled as hostile. She also knew that if the Lakota were forced out before their wounded man healed, he might die on the trail. Every fiber in her being rebelled against that. She tried a compromise. "Sheriff, maybe we give them a few days, see if the man recovers well enough to ride. If he doesn't, I'll come to town, and we can figure out another solution. But if he does, let them leave in peace." McKenna exhaled, scanning the tribe, and then turning to the uneasy group of townsmen behind him. "All right," he relented. "We can afford a few days, but I'm warning you, Margaret. If there's any trouble, any at all, I'm bringing the cavalry in." Margaret nodded, though her heart hammered. Understood. But inside she ached at how quickly her neighbors were willing to resort to violence. Then McKenna leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Margaret could hear. "We don't want trouble with you either. The folks in town see you're a widow living alone out here. They might think you've lost your mind helping these Indians. Take care, Margaret. Don't cross a line you can't step back from." She bit her tongue, refusing to dignify his patronizing words with a response. As the sheriff and his entourage turned to ride away, Jacob Brindle shot her a parting glare. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said coldly. Margaret watched them go, torn between anger and gratitude that no blood had been shed that afternoon. She turned back to the Lakota camp. The old man Sung Manitou raised a hand in a silent gesture of thanks or farewell. She nodded in return, wishing she could speak plainly, share that she was doing her best to keep them safe too. So began an uneasy truce. The Lakota would remain near Margaret's farm, tending their wounded warrior, and the townsfolk, swayed by the sheriff's reluctant patience, would not force the tribe away yet. But Margaret sensed it was a fragile piece, like a glass figurine perched at the edge of a table. One jolt, one heated moment, and it could shatter beyond repair. That evening, as the purple hues of twilight draped the prairie, the Lakota tribe lit their cooking fires. Women pounded dried meat into pemmican, while men sat in small circles, smoking long pipes that glowed like fireflies in the shadows. The wounded warrior, whose name Margaret learned was Red Eagle, showed signs of improvement. He managed to sit up and accept a bowl of broth offered by one of the older women. His sister, the young woman who had spoken a few words of English, fussed over him tirelessly. Margaret stood at the edge of the camp, a hesitant guest in her own land. She inhaled the savory scents of roasting buffalo meat. Hunger stirred within her. She had been living on meager rations for weeks, her own pantry nearly barren until the next harvest. As if reading her thoughts, Red Eagle's sister approached and offered a wooden bowl of stew. Margaret placed a hand on her chest in gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. The young woman nodded. "I am Winona." She said the words, careful and deliberate. She pointed to herself again. "Winona." Margaret repeated it softly. Then she touched her own chest. "Margaret." Winona tilted her head, trying to say the unfamiliar name. Garrett. She smiled. The warmth in that smile transcended language. They shared the stew, and though the conversation remained sparse, the sense of companionship deepened. With gestures, Margaret tried to ask how Red Eagle was doing. Winona replied in a flurry of Lakota words, pointing to her brother, pantomiming him riding a horse again. Margaret gathered that he would be able to ride in a few days, though he'd be weak for some time. The older man, Sung Manitu, joined them by the fire. He regarded Margaret with a calm, measured gaze. Soft lines around his eyes hinted at an age beyond his years. A man who'd witnessed countless cycles of buffalo hunts, and more recently, the endless encroachment of settlers. He said something to Winona, who nodded and turned to Margaret. "My father says you are good," she translated haltingly. Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes. That acknowledgement, simple as it was, felt profound. She offered a small bow of her head, trying to convey her appreciation. In the flickering firelight, she noticed Sung Manitu wore a necklace made of carved bone, etched with symbols she did not understand. He caught her gaze. With gentle pride, he lifted it for her to see, pointing to an intricate carving of a wolf's head. He spoke softly, and Winona translated as best she could. He says this spirit, wolf, guides him in dreams, watches over his family. Though Margaret did not share their spiritual beliefs, she felt an unexpected kinship. She thought of the cross she kept on her bedside table, a relic of her own faith and a reminder of her husband. Different symbols, but both cherished, both signifying hope. The night deepened, and as children were ushered to bed, the camp quieted. Margaret felt eyes on her, some of the tribe still wary, uncertain of her. But there was also an undercurrent of respect. She had done right by one of their own. In a land where so many turned to violence and hatred, that small kindness stood out like a beacon in the darkness. Before returning to her farmhouse, Margaret paused at Red Eagle's bedside in the barn. He looked up and their eyes met. Though he still winced from pain, he offered a nod of thanks. Margaret gently placed her hand on his uninjured shoulder, mustering a soft smile. Then she retreated to her kitchen, filled with conflicting emotions. She thought about the sheriff's warning, the hungry looks of Jacob Brindle. She considered how quickly an army patrol could be summoned to drive out or slaughter the Lakota. The fragile alliance weighed on her heart. That night, instead of the normal hush of the plains, Margaret heard the distant haunting melodies of a Lakota flute and the soft drone of chanting. Though she couldn't understand the words, the sound lulled her into a dream where she walked through tall grass guided by a shimmering figure who bore the form of both a man and a wolf. In her dream, she felt no fear, only a deep, encompassing peace. 3 days passed, each one a tentative dance between the Lakota and the settlers. Sheriff McKenna rode out every morning to check on the situation, but finding nothing amiss, he could only grumble and return to town. Margaret's neighbors began gossiping. Some claimed she was consorting with savages, while others spread rumors that her farm was under siege. Despite these whispers, nothing violent occurred. Red Eagle steadily recovered. Each day, he tested his strength by walking a few steps with Winona's support. Soon the tribe would leave. Margaret could feel the inevitable drawing near. But not everyone wanted a peaceful resolution. Jacob Brindle, the store owner, was a man who thrived on fear and suspicion. He stoked the embers of prejudice among the townsfolk, warning them that the Lakota presence would ruin their trade routes or bring cavalry retribution upon Grayton. He visited the sheriff daily, demanding action. When that failed, he began courting the more trigger-happy men in the settlement, whispering that it was time to take the matter into their own hands. One evening, Brindle gathered a small group of local troublemakers at the back of his store. They huddled around a flickering lantern, exchanging hushed words. Among them was Tom Wilcox, a disgruntled rancher who'd lost some cattle the previous year and blamed any misfortune on Indians. Also present was Luther Finch, a tall, lanky man with an itchy trigger finger, known for stirring up violence when he got a few drinks in him. Brindle spoke in a low, urgent tone. "Look, boys, the sheriff's not going to do anything until it's too late. Next thing you know, these savages will be riding into town, scalping us in our sleep. We gotta handle it ourselves." Tom Wilcox nodded grimly. "I won't let them roam free. I say we burn 'em out. Send a message that we don't tolerate trespassers." Luther Finch grinned a nasty grin. "Hell, I'm up for a fight. Been too long since I put that rifle to good use." Brindle held up a hand. "Now keep your heads. We don't want to start a war if we can avoid it. But we can scare 'em off, make 'em scatter." He paused, leaning closer to the lantern's glow. "I've got a plan. We ride out after dark, circle around that farm. If we can set fire to a few of their teepees and shoot at the ground around their horses, they'll run. Won't have the nerve to come back." The men nodded in grim agreement, adrenaline already coursing through their veins. A few other conspirators voiced concerns about the sheriff's reaction, but Brindle dismissed them. "McKenna's hands are tied. He'll be grateful once we handle this. Now gather your weapons. Tonight's the night." Meanwhile, back at Margaret's farm, she carried a small tray of cornbread and jerky to the Lakota camp. The tribe had shared their provisions with her, and now she wanted to return the favor, though she knew her offering was meager. Winona greeted her with a bright smile, guiding Margaret to Red Eagle. He was standing unaided for the first time since he arrived. His eyes flickered with cautious optimism. Soon Winona said, pointing east, as if indicating their journey. "We leave." Margaret nodded. "I understand," she replied softly. She found herself torn, relieved that the potential for conflict might finally subside, yet sorrowful to see them go. In a few short days, she had felt more genuine warmth from these strangers than she had from many of her own neighbors in years. Winona must have read her expression. She placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Friend," Winona said in English, a word that clearly cost her some effort. Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes unbidden. She grasped Winona's hand, moved by the simple power of the bond they had formed, despite language and cultural divides. But beyond the circle of firelight in the gloom of dusk, shadows moved with a different purpose. Jacob Brindle and his men crept closer to the farm hearths, pounding hungry for confrontation. A restless wind blew across the plains that night, rustling the tall grasses into a soft symphony. Margaret stood on her porch, gazing out at the silhouettes of teepees under the moonlight. A sense of unease pricked at her like a warning from some inner voice. She scanned the darkness, searching for anything out of place, but saw nothing. Finally, she turned in, closing the door behind her. Inside, she set a pot of water on the stove to boil for tea. The flicker of lamplight cast her shadow on the peeling wallpaper. A sudden bark from the barn startled her. One of the horses was spooked. She stepped to the window, her heart thumping. Still nothing. Perhaps the wind. Then faintly she smelled smoke. Alarm jolted her. Grabbing the lantern, she rushed outside. At first, she saw only darkness. Then she heard shouts, Lakota voices raised in alarm. She rounded the corner of the barn, and her blood ran cold. A teepee on the far edge of the encampment was ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the canvas. Figures darted back and forth, trying to douse the fire with blankets and water. Some grabbed bows and rifles, scanning the shadows for attackers. It wasn't an accident. Margaret spotted flickers of gunfire from beyond her fence muzzle flashes, lighting the night. Bullets thudded into the ground around the Lakota horses, causing them to rear and whinny. The tribe scrambled for weapons, though confusion hindered them. Who was attacking and from where Margaret's mouth went dry? She realized with horror that townsfolk must be behind this. Shots rang out again, answering the question. The Lakota, many of whom had been dozing, sprang into action. Warriors rushed to defend their families. Women guided children away from the flames. Pandemonium erupted. Margaret ran toward the flaming tipi, ignoring the dangerous hail of bullets. She grabbed a bucket of water from near the well, tossing it at the base of the fire. Winona appeared at her side, eyes wide with terror and fury. Together they beat at the flames with soaked blankets. Coughing from the smoke, Margaret glimpsed a terrified mother, clutching a wailing infant nearby. Shots echoed from beyond the barn. She recognized the frantic whoops of men who had probably never faced a real battle. A cry of pain rang out from the darkness. Then came the returning crack of rifles from the Lakota warriors. Fear clutched Margaret's gut. This was spiraling into a full-blown fight, and blood would be shed on both sides. Amid the chaos, a bullet shattered one of the barn's windows. Another slammed into the well's wooden cover, spraying splinters. The blaze spread to a second teepee, and the air filled with acrid smoke. Margaret's eyes watered. She could barely see, but she heard a terrified horse screaming, tangling in its tether as sparks landed on its mane. At last, the Lakota managed to form a defensive perimeter, returning fire at the unseen assailants. Margaret spotted a figure in the gloom, creeping closer with a lit torch. She blinked away smoke, straining to see. It looked like Luther Finch, the lanky troublemaker from town. He hurled the torch onto the ground near another tipi. Flames sputtered on the grass, but the dew helped snuff it out. A Lakota warrior sighted him and fired a shot which whizzed past Finch's head, causing him to dive for cover. Panic seized him. He scrambled back, losing his torch in the process. Gunfire continued from both sides. Margaret felt a hand on her shoulder. Red Eagle, limping but upright, holding a rifle. He barked a command she didn't understand, motioning for her to get down. She complied, dropping to her knees, the flames illuminating the stark terror in her eyes. Red Eagle fired a warning shot into the air, then another into the distance. He was clearly still weak, but desperate to help. Winona grabbed Margaret's arm and pulled her behind the barn for shelter. "Stay safe," she shouted, her limited English sufficient to convey the urgency. Then Winona darted off, bow in hand, adrenaline fueling her as she joined her people in fending off the attackers. From behind the barn, Margaret peered into the raging scene. The Lakota tribe was awake and fighting back. Their silhouettes flickered in the glow of campfires and burning canvas. A few of the braver townsmen shouted curses occasionally, firing blindly into the camp. The rest had fled, lacking the stomach for a prolonged battle against well-trained warriors. Finally, a voice boomed above the gunfire. "Retreat, damn you!" It was Jacob Brindle. He realized the ambush wasn't going as planned. The Lakota were armed and prepared to defend themselves. One of Brindle's men lay groaning in pain, shot through the leg. Another had vanished entirely, presumably lost in the chaos. Brindle fired one last shot into the air, a bitter curse on his lips, and then spurred his horse. Hooves thundered in the darkness. One by one the assailants withdrew, leaving behind the smell of gunpowder and scorched fabric. The Lakota didn't chase them far. though a few warriors followed to ensure they fully retreated. In the aftermath, the camp reeled. 2 Lakota had been wounded by stray bullets. One older warrior lay on the ground clutching a blood-soaked arm. A young teenager nursed a grazing shot to his shoulder. The mother with the infant sobbed as she cradled her terrified child. Smoke still curled from the remains of one teepee, while another had partial burns. Horses snorted in panic, requiring calm hands to soothe them. Margaret emerged from behind the barn, tears streaking her smoke-darkened face. She rushed to help the wounded. The tribe let her approach their earlier trust, bolstered by the fact that she had fought the fire with them. Winona was already tending the older warrior. She met Margaret's gaze, eyes swimming with anger and betrayal. Margaret wanted to say she was sorry that she hadn't known about this plan, that it was the work of a vicious few. But words wouldn't suffice. Red Eagle stood nearby, leaning on his rifle. Rage tightened his features. His wound was freshly bleeding again from the exertion, but he ignored it. He looked at Margaret as if searching for an explanation. She could offer only a shake of her head. Sorrow mingling with shame, silent tears marking her cheeks. The Lakota had been attacked on her farm by her own people. The fragile peace was gone, replaced by the harsh reality that some men would not tolerate their presence, no matter how peaceful their intentions. Even though the ambush failed to rout them, it irrevocably shattered any illusion of safety. Margaret's mind whirled. How would this end now? Would the Lakota pack up and leave tonight, fearful of another ambush? Or would they fortify themselves, expecting another assault? Would the cavalry be next, raining down bullets and cannon fire? She prayed silently for reason to prevail for the violence to stop. But in the smoldering darkness with wounded, moaning and the faint smell of blood on the wind, Margaret feared this was only the beginning of a much larger storm. The next morning, the sunrise revealed the full extent of the night's damage. 2 teepees were destroyed, a scorched circle of grass marking where the fire had taken hold. Acrid smoke still lingered. Lakota children huddled close to their parents, eyes wide with lingering terror. Their entire camp seemed on edge, scanning the horizon for signs of another attack. Margaret spent the early hours tending to the wounded alongside Winona. She used strips of clean cloth to bind the older warrior's injured arm, improvising what she could from her meager medical supplies. Each hiss of pain felt like a dagger in her chest. With every groan, she was reminded that her people had done this. As she was tying the final bandage, a murmur swept through the camp. She turned to see a column of riders approaching at a gallop. Sheriff McKenna and more than a dozen men, some official deputies, others volunteers brandishing rifles. Margaret's heart plummeted. There was no telling how the Lakota would react after last night's unprovoked attack. Sung Manitou stepped forward, old eyes fierce. He and several warriors formed a line between the sheriff's posse and the main camp. For a moment it looked as though the standoff would erupt into immediate bloodshed. Margaret sprinted toward the sheriff. Arms raised, her voice cracking with urgency. "Stop, don't shoot!" McKenna reined in his horse. Dust billowed around them. Behind him, Jacob Brindle's face was set in grim determination, a band of troublemakers at his side. Other townsmen, some more reluctant, shifted nervously on their mounts. "What the hell happened here?" McKenna demanded. His gaze swept over the burnt teepees, the wounded Lakota. Then he fixed his eyes on Margaret. "Was this your doing, or theirs?" Margaret shook her head, pointing at Brindle. "He led an ambush last night. They fired on the Lakota set fires. The Lakota only defended themselves. At that, Sangmanatu gestured angrily toward Brindle. He spat a string of Lakota words, his face a thundercloud of rage. Jacob Brindle bristled. "She's lying. We only came to scare them off. It was them who opened fire first." Margaret whirled on him, fury snapping in her eyes. "Don't lie, Jacob. I saw one of your men throwing a torch." A few other men in the posse muttered uncertainly, glancing at Brindle. McKenna held up a hand for silence, scanning the group. "Damn it. Jacob, did you gather a band to attack them?" "We had an agreement to wait and see if they left peacefully." Brindle squared his shoulders, though sweat beaded on his brow. "I did what was necessary, Sheriff. They weren't leaving. It was only a matter of time before they turned on us." He gestured wildly at the Lakota. "Look at them well armed. This is a war party." McKenna stared stone-faced. He was no fool. The evidence of a night attack was plain. The sheriff might have harbored prejudice, but he wasn't blind. "God damn it, Jacob, you've started a fire we can't easily put out." Tension swelled like a rising tide. The Lakota warriors gripped their weapons, glaring at the posse. The men from town looked on edge, fingers twitching near triggers. Margaret's heart hammered, convinced this was the moment everything would explode. Then unexpectedly, Sangmanatu stepped forward. He laid his rifle on the ground at his feet, a sign of no immediate aggression, then pointed at the wounded among his people. His gaze bore into McKenna's. He spoke in Lakota voice, trembling with the weight of sorrow and anger. Winona translated in broken English, stepping beside her father. He says, "We came in peace. We were attacked. We bleed. We die. Yet, you come with more guns. Is this your promise of friendship?" The sheriff's eyes flickered a fleeting moment of shame crossing his features. Then he sighed. "We don't want any more bloodshed, old man," he replied, unsure if Sangmanatu could catch his meaning. "But you can't stay here any longer. It's too dangerous now." Margaret's throat tightened. She understood the sheriff's logic. Another night like the last, and the entire area would be a battlefield. But she also knew the Lakota had wounded people, including Red Eagle. Forcing them to move immediately could be deadly. She found her voice. "Sheriff, they need at least a day, 2 maybe. If we push them out now, we're sentencing their injured to death." Brindle barked a laugh. "Better them than us, I say." Margaret's anger burst like a broken dam. "You hateful fool. This never had to happen." She turned to the sheriff, desperation in her eyes. "We can still do the right thing." McKenna hesitated, the conflict etched in every line of his face. Behind him, his men looked anxious, uncertain. Then the sheriff's gaze hardened, and he said to Sangmanatu, "Your wounded can stay. But after that, you all must go. I'll give you 2 days. Any longer, I can't guarantee your safety from folks who want you gone." A flicker of relief passed through Margaret, though it was doused by the knowledge that this was only a reprieve. Winona translated, and Sangmanatu listened with grave demeanor. His jaw set, and after a moment, he gave a single nod. 2 days to rest, to tend to the wounded, and then they would depart. It was the best compromise possible in a tinderbox situation. Jacob Brindle spat on the ground, glaring. "You're letting them off easy, Sheriff." McKenna shot him a hard look. "I'm upholding the law and preventing a massacre. You watch yourself, Brindle." Then he turned his horse, addressing the Lakota in as calm a tone as he could muster. 2 days. Sangmanatu inclined his head. Winona repeated the phrase. 2 days. A moment later, the Lakota parted to allow the sheriff's posse to pass. The men rode away, tension unbroken, until they disappeared over the horizon. Margaret exhaled the breath she'd been holding. Tears threatened again, but she blinked them away. She turned to Winona and sung Manitou, wishing she had the words to convey how sorry she was for the attack. In the end, all she could do was lightly touch her heart and whisper, "I'm so sorry," hoping they understood. Sung Manitou laid a hand gently on her shoulder, as if to say he knew she had tried to help. Still, the unspoken question remained. Would 2 days be enough to mend wounds both physical and emotional, and avert a greater tragedy? Time raced past in a blur of worry and frantic care for the wounded. Margaret gave all she had, her linens for bandages, her small store of oats to help feed to the children. As the end of the second day approached, Red Eagle insisted on walking around the camp, testing his strength. He grimaced with each step, but he managed to keep upright, a sign of improvement that lifted everyone's spirits. By the evening of that second day, the Lakota began to strike their camp. Teepees came down poles, bundled horses saddled. Mothers gathered children close. Warriors checked their rifles and bows, preparing for what might lie ahead. An air of wary determination swept through the tribe. They would travel under the cover of night, avoiding further ambushes. Margaret moved among them, offering what small words of encouragement she could, though the language barrier was still large. Winona embraced her, tears glistening. Margaret held the young woman, heart aching at the thought that she might never see her again. They had shared so many moments of kindness in so little time. Red Eagle approached next. He rested a hand on Margaret's shoulder, gazing into her eyes with a sincere gratitude that transcended speech. Then, with a careful motion, he removed a small medicine pouch from around his neck. He pressed it into Margaret's hands. The pouch was made of soft leather and decorated with tiny beads. She stared, uncertain how to respond. This was undoubtedly a treasured possession. "I can't accept," she began, but Winona softly cut her off. "Thanks," she explained in broken English. "His spirit, your spirit, together." Margaret swallowed hard, touched beyond words. She clutched the pouch to her chest, blinking back tears. In that moment, she thought of how drastically her life had changed in just a few days. How the walls of suspicion had crumbled, replaced by bonds forged through compassion and adversity. As night descended, the Lakota finished packing. Sung Manitou gave the signal. One by one, riders and wagons began moving eastward across the open plains. Winona was among them, leading a horse that carried Red Eagle. The wounded warrior glanced back, meeting Margaret's gaze under the moon's pale glow. She raised a hand in farewell. He returned the gesture faintly before his sister urged the horse onward. Margaret watched them disappear into the vast darkness, a caravan of silent shadows, bound for uncertain horizons. Only the memory of their campfires remained flickering in her mind's eye. She stood there for a long while, the night wind tugging at her hair, the medicine pouch clutched in her hand. Eventually she turned back to her farmhouse, stooping to pick up the scattered remnants of the short-lived alliance. Broken arrows, charred blankets, a single horseshoe. She brought these items to the barn, storing them as reminders of this extraordinary chapter in her life. By dawn, the Lakota were gone without a trace, save for a few footprints in the soft earth. The sheriff arrived to confirm their departure, accompanied by a reluctant Jacob Brindle. They found Margaret in the barn, tending to her own animals, as though life could return to normal. "All clear?" McKenna asked, scanning the horizon. "They're gone," Margaret confirmed quietly. "Good," he muttered, though his tone wasn't harsh. Perhaps he felt something akin to relief. Brindle, however, cast a suspicious eye around the property. He snorted. "Well, I hope we've seen the last of 'em. Maybe now we can get back to business without living in fear." Margaret didn't grace him with a response. She brushed down her horse, focusing on the simple tasks that anchored her. McKenna and Brindle eventually departed, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The wind rustled the remaining corn stalks, a lonely sound. Later that day, Margaret took the medicine pouch Red Eagle had given her and placed it next to her late husband's cross on the mantel. Two symbols of faith, side by side, a testament to the unexpected ways different worlds could collide and how humanity could bridge even the widest gulfs. She said a silent prayer for the tribe's safe passage, wishing them healing and peace wherever they roamed. Then she prayed for her own people, that their hearts might soften, that they might learn from this, that they might choose compassion over fear. Days turned into weeks. Margaret heard distant rumors of cavalry movements in the territory of other conflicts, sparking along the frontier. Yet in that corner of the Great Plains, her farm stood as a quiet monument to a fleeting alliance. Neighbors continued to treat her with suspicion, but she remained resolute, unbowed. She planted new seeds of corn, fixed her fences, and carried on the homestead as best she could, her courage shaped and tempered by the events she had witnessed. And whenever she felt doubt creep in or loneliness haunt her nights, she would touch the medicine pouch, remembering the warrior she once sheltered the tribe that stood around her farm, and the fragile, precious moments of trust they had shared. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the dusty plains and turbulent encounters of the Wild West. If this story moved you, if you felt the tension, the heartache, and ultimately the hope found in compassion, please show your support. Like this video to help it reach more adventurers. Share it with friends who appreciate powerful, dramatic tales of courage and connection across cultural divides. And most importantly, subscribe to my channel to catch the next thrilling installment of storytelling that explores humanity's brightest lights and darkest shadows. Your presence here is what keeps this storytelling tradition alive. It's a reminder that empathy, respect, and understanding can rise above fear. Thank you for being part of that message. Together we can keep these tales of bravery and unity echoing across the digital frontier. Until next time, travel safe and stay inspired.